gonna happen.
Okay, got it.
My goodness.
All right, we are live now and we'll start our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your patience. Ross Dental, Public Transit Program Manager. And today we just want to follow up on last week's conversation. I was able to listen in on Friday's conversation as well. And so we're looking forward to just sharing some perspective and activity with you. And that, to begin with, I just wanted to mention the level of support and ongoing funding that we provide already to the urban system. And the GMT rural funds come through like they do the rest of the rural state, and they come through us. And in FY23, we provide the 5.35 million in FHWA funds with about $1 million in state funds. And this doesn't include capital with all the electric buses and facility upgrades and the like, but this is just operating. And overall, VTrans contributes about 80 to 85% of the operation costs with our federal and state funds throughout the rural area. For GMT Urban, we use a flex letter direct from our FHWA program to go to their urban budget, as well as provide another $2.3 million in state funds to help them with their non-federal match. That equates to about 55 to 60% of the operating costs with federal and state funds through our public transit budget at VTrans. And already in FY24, working through the budget committee, we are penciling in the 2.3 million now for state funds before we talk about the $1 million ask here. But we're already contributing quite a bit of money into the urban system from our VTrans FHWA program, our FTA funds, and as it should be, because this is our urban area that really does justify more robust service. I did want to mention, we talked a little bit about the small transit intensive cities, or the STIC funds. And based on hours and miles and ridership, GMT achieves another $1.1 million in funding, not least of which because of the additional funds that we bring into there. So that access allows us to access another $1 million plus for the urban system. Just another way for us to talk about we're here and that we're working with GMT Urban and Rural every year. I wanted to just look at the language, Section 8, Section 9. And we talked about Section 8 last week, and I was able to listen in to the conversation on Friday. And some of the conversation was, well, it looks like we're going to have two systems in place. And indeed, we do. We have the rural system and the urban system. And we contribute to both, as we just saw, on the zero fare policy. In rural, it was about a $500,000 cost to stay fare-free throughout the entire state outside of the one urban area. There, the service is already zero fare. There's a higher handling cost that were cited. We have fewer riders on these vehicles, and the cost of handling the service, those dollars, is a little bit more than it is in urban. And again, working through our budget committee, the $500,000 as part of our $9 million state funds allowed us to go one more year, zero fare, see what that does as we get back to normal post-COVID demands. The fares in the urban is quite a different kettle of fish. When we talk about the staff and the Board of Commissioners agreeing to proceed with reinstituting fares, the larger gap that they need to cover because of the efficiencies and their ridership being half of all of the state's ridership, they have this increased fare box recovery. And of course, relatively speaking, fares may be in order in the urban system because you have a more robust set of options, and you can really live in that city without relying on a car, unlike most of our rural areas. So as a result, the fares are there because we hope and we agree that it's worth it. On the $1 million, last week, if you remember, Nick said, well, we don't need $1 million total in state funds. So we jumped on that and said, okay, if we were to increase what we expected to provide in FHWA flex funds, CMAQ and other, if we were to also up our contribution from the 2.3 to 2.55 with state funds, that would leave about $150,000 for GMT to cover through their fund reserves, maintaining a reasonable reserve. And it would also provide an option for GMT to apply for mobility and transportation innovation funds to cover any of the last remaining costs associated with the FAIR process. It could be 85, it could be a little bit more, but really looking at that last piece and that last bucket of funds to get to the $1 million before the full grant application process, which I'm trying to limit commitments until I go through the application process to be fair to all the rural applicants as well. We're comfortable with this. It would allow us to put the $1 million back into maintenance, and we will have been able to get through this hurdle together with our current budget.
Could you clarify the 150 from GMT reserves? If they got up to the 100,000, would that be net of the 150? So it leaves only 50 demand on reserves. Is that the 100 against the 150?
It would be total. That's the final 250 of the $1 million ask. 500,000 federal, 250 upfront state, and then the 250.
So that's how you get your 250.
Exactly. And so we're glad to have moved through this. We were talking through last night, ensuring that we're all comfortable on the approach. It's not perfect, but it certainly is a reasonable step. All of our providers have competing
Some of the MTI funds are not a sure deal, as you said, that it could be up to 100, it could be less. And then the remainder would fall on GMT.
That's correct. And leaving them not 2 months of reserves, but 1.9 months of reserves, those types of things.
Yeah, my concern is this seems like a promise of the MTI funds. And it also doesn't seem like, maybe I don't understand the MTI program, but it doesn't seem like something that would, the way I think of the MTI program, that would qualify. How are you qualifying it for the MTI? Like, what's the innovation?
Well, certainly to look at the fare free policy that was just published, there is an increased ridership projection that goes along with maintaining zero fares. So conceptually, there could be an argument made that with $100,000, there could be a certain amount of ridership that could be associated with that, which we could then use for metrics. Here's the real hope, is that they can move through this fare implementation process for $900,000, that they could look at other MTI projects, for other activities, or after we go through the funding process with all the providers, I could withhold a certain amount of state funds, which I try to do for the mid-year adjustments. Every year in December, January, we're talking about more E&D services. Can you move admin to ops, ops to admin? All of that being told, I'm hoping we can move forward without the MTI. But if necessary, that could be a reasonable investment with our MTI funds, especially if it is going toward this fair system, which is really interesting to see how that's going to resolve. And this is in September. By then, we'll have a far better idea, true costs, true benefits of a fair fare, what's that going to look like in revenues. And so it's like I mentioned, it's not perfect, but it does get us down the road. And if we're talking $100,000 one way or the other, there's our options. No, I hope not. Our internal budget adjustment.
No, right, that's what I'm just saying.
Yeah, our budget, I think we can float it, but boy, I didn't want to commit too much of state funds before I go through the grant applications at the end of this month. And so this was something we discussed through last night.
Question?
So the 250 is from T funds, and where are you getting you're having to make some modification in your transportation plan to free them up, or can you explain where you're finding those?
Right now, the budget includes $9.04 million in state funds. And we go through and work with our providers with their finance committees to identify their budget for the following
So
year.
it's coming out of your state.
That 9 million, and instead of the 2.3 million that they have penciled in, that I have penciled in, I'm now penciling in that 2.55 to take on that extra 250,000. A lot of this has to do with carryover funds. We have a lot of capital items that we have obligated state funds to, and if that doesn't come in on time, I have a process with our budget committee say, hey, we have 500,000 still on the books for carryover items. Can we keep those dollars? And then that certainly frees up some other activities. Also, some capital comes in less than what we obligated. So at the end of the year, we may have some funds to carry over after already taking care of that capital item.
And you're not on the FHWA, is that there's just more capacity to draw it down?
Well,
Or are you moving something around on that?
we're moving something around on that, primarily because of the COVID funds over the last several years. We're starting the year with a few $1 million in flex funds from this year. And so that allows us a little bit more latitude to provide more flex funds to GMT. And then if we have to use our remaining 1.1 million in COVID funds to help others to cover their activities to sustain services, we do have that latitude for this year. It's almost, we're very lucky to be having this conversation this year than in previous years, because we do have a little bit of FHWA flex money that we can obligate, more so than we would normally plan.
Yes.
I would just elaborate and expand upon Senator Persick's concern, not this, that they might not get the $100,000, being that it doesn't really seem very innovative. It seems like an operational coverage of a gap. I'm also worried that if they do get it, that's $100,000 less dollars for what I would argue might be more genuine mobility and transportation innovation. So that's my concern with that 100K.
Yeah.
And would you be moving back the million or the 750 to the maintenance, the house?
Yeah. we
The
may-
full million.
Yeah.
The full million.
Yeah.
And then when the 250 of state funds, that's state transportation fund.
Correct. So instead of the 2.3, it's going to be 2.55 at this current juncture. Generally, what happens is this would be part of their grant application, and then we would be trying to look at all their activities. Can you use 100% COVID monies for these, and then I can give you FHWA monies for that activity. Then, if we added, our state, and so right now the $9 million coming to us has to cover capital, our electric buses that are coming in, and we project how many electric buses we're going to be getting. If we get those full 16 cutaways, that's a lot of money. We're looking at longer delivery times than we probably are hoping for. So that could leave some of the state funds on the books to help, cover some of these stopgap measures. 100,000 out of a $9 million, $48 million budget is a comfortable place to be, considering all the other obligations that we have in conversations just like this with all of our providers.
Anybody in the room?
Well, this is just a follow-up. I think Clayton mentioned something about, putting together a funding package, and this seems to do it. I was concerned about the other part around fare free and having that potentially unfunded mandate and having some kind of recognition before we made it a somewhat less than. I mean, they're always financially challenging, public transit is, just putting on a burden that we might not fully understand.
We share those concerns, and that's why this next slide is to talk about that language, which is certainly reducing fares for needs riders makes sense, and looking at higher fares for choice riders makes sense as well. But we know that will impact ridership and revenues to some degree. But like you mentioned, we're not sure yet. Also, the previous fare structure did allow for reduced fares for the elderly, people with disabilities, the universal access.
And we
When,
were funding those through other means.
absolutely, but those were reduced fares for the rider, and we were able to cover those services. When we're talking about, okay, well, if these folks who have these qualifications get a reduction, but these folks don't, we're just wondering, like, somebody, let's say, is getting into Richmond and they're being asked for a $5 link charge, but now there's going to be zones where that's going to be $4, but if you go into Williston, it's $5. It could add complexity. It could add some nuance to the fare structure that could, affect people, looking at, accessing the service. Not an issue. It's just something that when Clayton talks, we'll meet till January. Now I'm starting to understand why the January piece may be required because of some of these nuances and added benefits for different slices of the population. It's definitely something we can appreciate. We're just concerned, like you, with overall, when they move through those fares projections. We just wanted to make sure that the plan does address a plan to cover those lost revenues outside of coming here next year. We can have those conversations, and we had a nice hour conversation while you're on the floor together talking about next steps, and it was really something that was long overdue. So we're okay there as well, and we're looking forward to participating with the fair plan. Fair, yeah. The second piece we just want to talk about before we turn it over to GMT is Section 9, which is this CCRP plan. To take a look at the previous studies to come up with a written recommendation on a dedicated funding source. That's understandable. And I know that from last Friday, there were some concerns about that last study that showed different tax revenues and fees to contribute to more sustainable non-federal match funding. And I'm happy to speak about any of those concerns that you would have. Was it too limited? Did we not think about other options? And for us, we're just trying to figure out what the revenues and service goals would be for those alternative funding approaches. Would we be looking at replacing the non-federal revenues to the existing revenue levels? Do we want to increase revenues? Do we want to decrease the administrative activity that it takes to collect from local sources? Have we seen T funds moving down and that we want to replace T funds? We're not exactly sure what that goal or need is.
Could I just, the language that was put in, and we're talking about in the House passed version, that didn't come from the agency, or it came from the
No.
House?
Yes.
That language was nothing you asked for. Okay, and so, thank you.
Well,
So this is your response, and obviously you listened to our response about our concerns about that language. So our colleagues in the House put that language in.
Yes, and they deserve a visit from me very soon, I think.
No, I just wanted to clarify the genesis of the language.
Nothing wrong with getting together and looking at the three studies and assessing, like, okay, these are what's been placed out there is what New York does and Maryland and everywhere else. And what are we missing and what would their recommendation be? But we're curious, like the last report did add $5 million from a $16 or $21 million non-federal revenue stream, because that would have allowed the system to provide a mobility for all option under our dial-a-ride. We have elderly and persons with disability, recovery, job access. What are we missing? That mobility for all would allow for those same constraints to be an option for anyone in the state. You don't have to meet a criteria, you just need that mobility need. And we thought we could probably cover that for maybe $5 million. Very difficult to, and I know that people were talking about the we all pay a little approach, which is what we focused on, or what Steve focused on with the RPC, and someone else pays the tourism, the rental car tax, the second homeowners and the like. And all we can see, and I sit on a national panel for zero fare studies with folks from all over the country $300,000 project, which is something we would never get to touch. And I'm not seeing a lot of other options when they come into different ways to fund transit or to reduce fares, whether it's Washington DC or Kansas City, two of the larger cities that have gone to zero fare service. They are relying on local and or regional taxes and fees. And without those fare increases, we have had a hard time identifying other non-federal funds, like can we get a sponsorship program, and can we get pro teams to donate, and those things haven't been forthcoming. And so anyway, that's just our approach and our concerns. And when we talk about service goals, I did want to confirm with this committee that if the service goal is to sustain services or expand services, we have two discussions here. One, the current funding model is sustaining rural services at this time. GMT Urban is a little different, and we've been talking about how we could work with them differently to get them on a sustainable path forward. They talk about a federal cliff. They talk about the lack of fair revenues. That's a little different, but on the rural side, for the next few years, we should be able to sustain services with the current funding approach. The reason we can do that is because we're not sure of the value and the cost associated with the microtransit service. Is that something that is going to be so valuable that we need to expand that? Should it be combined with our E&D program, and so that they're not calling 48 hours in advance? Should we combine those two? Those are the conversations we're having with microtransit. We have this new scheduling dispatch software, the mobility for all pilots with community rides. All of those things could lead to us coming to this body saying, hey, we have a new approach to provide more mobility statewide through these pilots, but I don't have that yet. I don't know what it's going to cost. I don't know what the value is. And until then, naming a dollar figure and a service approach is a little bit premature, I think, for our comfort level at the agency, but not that we can't have the conversation and participate.
So do you have a recommended language as a replacement? Is that what you're leading to?
I'm afraid it is.
Okay.
No,
I wouldn't be afraid. We're hoping that we would have, based on our conversation, and Michelle was here last week, something that we felt more comfortable with, and so I was just wondering if this was all leading up to telling us what you think might be a better way of expressing what the work ahead. Yeah,
and I appreciate that, because putting this there's so many nuances here. Like, how do you drill down and make this a reasonable presentation? And it really was. One last item: if we run up against using all of our federal funds for operations, and we match that with our non-federal dollars, that's one thing, and that's wonderful that we can draw down all of our federal dollars for operations. But once we hit that level, all of those operations would look at 100% non-federal, and that's a whole different. It's not 20%, it's not a 50% match, it's 100%. It's not an approach that we've considered yet, and so there's a lot of work to be done in that regard. Here comes our recommendation, which is, well, and I talked about, all of these things could increase the demand response. We talked about microtransit or rural commuter or rural services. These are expensive services as they are now. And so depending on what the service expectations are, it could get very expensive very quickly, since we've already been able to establish services around the corridors and in the communities that generally can support transit at these current levels, which are more expensive than they ever have been.
Excuse me, Senator Mountain.
Yeah, good.
I just want to make sure everybody understands that this slide is representing the actual cost we are paying per ride. So in other words, if I'm taking the express commuter on the far right there for $30, I'm paying, well, not right now, I'm paying nothing. But if I were to maybe pay $4 or $5 like we used to, the state is still subsidizing the balance and the feds. Just want to make sure we understand.
We don't sell advertising on buses anymore, right?
We do.
We do.
About it.
And that's a big part of the non-fed match, but it's also a small percentage of overall match. A couple tens of thousands of dollars at most of our providers. Some do better than others.
Okay.
So the recommendation is fix it first, which is rather than look at new service, new models, what we would like for this committee to consider is a different study that would fully consider the graded service model. Oops. The current system allows for what we feel is efficient and coordinated service between public transit, the non-emergency medical transportation services, and that we would ask for the committee to consider the Agency of Transportation in consultation with AHS, the Division of Vermont Health Access, who manage Medicaid, and the Vermont Public Transportation Association will conduct an assessment for current systems delivering integrated
We
public
need a T on
transit. I guess I shouldn't have done this at 8:30 last night. And transit, and I got two things here. So currently termed the graded service. We want to establish the way we do it now, the benefits and risks thereof. The analysis shall include a review of other service approaches found throughout the US. We want to put on the table other approaches, third-party entities, and then recommendations on the management of statewide mobility services, design and management in order to achieve maximum efficiency and client access across the state. Shall be delivered to this committee as well as the House Committee on Human Services. This would be an opportunity for us to get together, to work on the scope together, look at the data, the alternatives, and also establish if NEMT was to be bifurcated from public transit, what would that effect be? How much would that increase our allocated costs for our vehicles, for our people, our computers, all the things that are efficient now? What would that look like if they were to become unbraided? And looking at states like Kentucky, they have a public transit advisory council. They call it their transportation advisory council, and it's their state entities that share it, and with folks like that, and they just work on their mobility needs together, understanding that mobility needs at AHS are similar to the mobility needs at VTrans. And is there a way that we could memorialize or at least all agree on the benefits, risks, and opportunities moving forward?
I have a couple of comments, one of which is, I think part of it is not only delivering, but we want to maximize available federal funding sources. Because braided service is really trying to maximize all the money you can bring into the system. And I think also, the whole intent was to ensure that those funding, our goal is to support a robust and responsive public transit system. So I think I think that should be the goal, because our concern in the past is you start on braiding, the risk is that you're going to weaken and you're going to remove resources out of that system. So I would want to, if we're going to look at that, it's not only the benefits, the risks, I guess, obviously there are disadvantages. But I would want to be clear that the purpose is to make our public transit system as robust and stable as possible. So I'd like to say we want to make sure that we're getting all those federal dollars to support it, and looking at how, because for all Vermonters benefit from the best public transit system we can afford.
Public transit.
So I would like to suggest we add those two pieces, Mr. Chair. I don't know what your thoughts are.
There's a National Center for Mobility Management, which was stood up by FTA a few years ago. And their whole goal and edict is to braid services together so you don't have the Medicaid bus following the public transit bus. As a result, we sit on the committee and we're invited to present our approach throughout the nation at webinars, because people are like, yeah, we got to do what Vermont does. That started so many years ago, and so we don't want to.
Makes me feel ancient.
Yeah, well, it's just a
I
few,
am.
just was a few years ago.
Like
Oh.
the 1980s, I
Right.
was thinking.
It was
I hate to
classic in
say it.
2007 when I got here. But it's true that this would really just, once and for all, just take a snapshot. Every couple of years, we have these discussions, but this would allow us to memorialize and really understand and appreciate and agree on our interagency coordination. In addition to the Council on Mobility Management, that we are seeing more and more opportunities to partner with AHS, like the Recovery and Job Access. They transfer $100,000 to our program. We put in our 100,000 and we provide recovery and job access. Those are the types of things that we want to do more of. This could allow us to identify those other services and mobility needs.
So this is instead of what's in section 9 now, not an addition.
It's as you wish. On the other site, section 9, we feel that something like this could entail VPTA or our RPCs bringing folks together, looking at the 3 reports that have been done to date. We have national studies, and then just really try to identify if there are recommendations and what those would be. The good news is with that last report that the RPC did, it just allows that to have something in the back pocket in case T funds tanked, or in case we found a great new way to provide mobility and economic activity throughout the state. But until then, the current funding system is holding, and this could just be maybe another review of those with another assessment of saying, of these 7 items, we kind of agree that utilities make sense, but we didn't consider tying in other non-federal approaches. So that could be a couple $1,000 and something.
Senator Moss.
You're right.
I just, I know we talked about this on Friday and with Anthea in the room, I believe, maybe not. We talked about taking the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission out of the mix. Senator Chittenden's recommendation and my recommendation was that VPTA with planning funds from VTrans to be able to retain a consultant could manage the contract for doing this analysis. And so they would be the lead, and we would have the league at the table, VTrans at the table for consultation, but really it's VPTA that would be bringing back a recommendation on funding options for local match, because this is really about where they are going to generate their long-term non-federal revenues that we need to make the whole system work.
So you're still talking about meeting that goal. I thought you were saying don't do that.
Well, for us, we think this one is a relative light lift compared to, finally getting to our braided system justification and kind of assessment there.
This way.
So I'm not opposed to the direction you're going in with this. My one concern is the way I see your new language proposed is I don't see the Vermont League of Cities and Towns or Municipalities. So I'm curious that this group is going to just say, you know what, all the local providers need to share the burden. So it's going to be the exact opposite of what the other one is. So I'm just wondering if there's a
They're still
better.
gonna do the other.
Yeah, that's,
This is an
yeah,
addition.
yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Uh-huh. That was.
So BPTA would pull them in at that point. And I just been with Karen earlier and talking a little bit about this. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so who else, any comments about this? Anybody in the room? Yes,
Mr. Chairman, Jamie Fune, I can speak on behalf of the VPTA in that role in the local study. I mean, it's encouraging to hear the agencies say that they will provide some funding, because the VPTA is a collection of not-for-profit providers. There's a staff of 1 and a part-time staff of another. So we don't have resources to do a study of this sort, but we do conduct RFPs and contract with others when resources are provided. Statewide contracting, software as an example, bus procurement as an example. So we're certainly in position to do that if the funds material is. Otherwise, the report may be reflective of the resources committed. The only issue I might raise is, as long as there's no perceived conflict of interest in this body, the provider agree back potential funding source and recommendation to fund themselves for the local contribution. We don't see that, but we'd hate to see something, run into that concern.
Questions, comments, anybody else?
Well, I would be happy to present after Ross, Senator Moss.
Okay. We only have a few minutes left, so.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, go ahead. Yeah. Gonna get you back running the bus service, you know what I mean?
I do. I'm gonna miss that 1 o'clock run. If I don't hurry up.
Yeah, that's right. Need you for a driver.
So Clayton Clark, General Manager of Green Mountain Transit. I just want to reiterate that we support the funding plan that Ross had presented. Also wanted to touch base on the language that the House included regarding discounted fares, and talked a bit with VTrans about this. And we have some minor recommended amendments to that language that I think that would help alleviate concerns. One of the things that I want to make clear is that in that language, it talks about free rides, and we want to make sure that it's clear that we're talking about free rides from the perspective of the rider, not that we're not collecting a payment either from like the university or from the Howard Center or from COTS.
Right.
And so we don't plan on giving, free rides to anybody, no free rides on GMT. And then the other thing that we thought about doing was that when we prepared our fiscal year 24 budget, we anticipated that revenues from fares would be about 11% of our revenues. And so we thought that including language in that portion of the T-bill to say that there has to be a minimum 10% projection for revenue to come out of our discounted fares, so that it would add a guardrail or a constraint to ensure that that we don't diminish the revenues to get us to that situation that we heard from Senator Kitchell with us being back here for
Well, I was just worried about your bottom line.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. And one of the things that I look at is that even though that language didn't require a cost review, we would certainly be doing that ourselves. So let's just make it, part of that language. And the other thing is that as I read the language as it was introduced, it's us advising House Transit and Senate committees on our system, not us providing it for approval. And so that's where I didn't really feel like it was a mandate. I'm sure that they will provide their perspectives, and but we can then go through that process and committee. And I didn't see this as us turning over our obligation to develop our own fare plan for their approval.
But are you suggesting though some modifications to the language that currently exists?
Yes,
And somebody will be.
I will. By the end of the day, I'll have that to Mike.
Okay.
Yes.
Excellent.
And then just need to get it to TNT.
Yeah.
And that is all that I had, but certainly happy to answer any questions folks may have.
Comments, anybody else? Everybody's on. Yes.
Since you're here, so I just heard you say you're fine with the 900,000 with the 100 maybe coming from MTI. You've agreed to that.
We've agreed to it. It spreads the pain. Obviously, we would prefer not to have that pain, but everybody prefers to avoid pain, and we accept that we can't get out of
Well,
it.
you have the 150 that's coming out of your reserve.
Yes, and that if we were not to get MTI and we did not meet our revenue projections, then that would just be more coming out of our reserve.
I might still advocate delicately for more money to the MTI grants, so I get through that part of the budget. But
Okay, anything else?
And then make the reduction on maintenance of just 100,000 versus 1 million.
I got some other ideas, but I don't want to cut into our lunch now.
It's a fee.
All by fight.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. All right, anything else? That's it.